Good evening, everyone. Glad you were able to join us tonight for another one of our wonderful March Madness webinars. I'd like to introduce our panel. Oh, first I need to remind you, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A box and we will answer those at the end. You are muted and your video is off for this webinar. Joining us tonight on the panel is Vicki Lauren, our secretary, and Ruth Steele-Walker, who's the co-treasurer, and she will be introducing Marnie.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. We're really fortunate to have Marnie Tichenel here again to talk with us about invasive species, this time about the threat to wildlife by non-native plants. Marnie earned her bachelor's and master's degrees at Ohio State University, and since 2007, she has been a wildlife extension program specialist for OSU. Her interest in wildlife began during annual family vacations that focused on the outdoors. She also has experience working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and USDA Forest Service. In 2006, she worked as a naturalist for the Columbus and Franklin County Metro Parks. There, she developed a passion for environmental education. So we're really glad to have her here to share that passion with us tonight. Thank you, Marty. Take it away.
Thank you, Ruth. Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here once again. And thank you so much to Ruth and Vicki and Sue for the invitation. And pause with me for 1 second because I forgot to bring up my chat box and I do want to be able to see any answers to the questions that I'm going to be asking you as they pop up. So, okay. Well, tonight I wanted to give you a few examples of how non-native invasive species are impacting our wildlife species. Now, tonight, I'm mostly going to be focusing on the impacts of non-native invasive plants on wildlife, though we will touch a little bit on the impact of a non-native invasive insect. But realize that our non-native invasive species cross many taxa. There are non-native invasive aquatic species, fungi, insects, and even some wildlife species are themselves non-native invasive species. And so I know you all are master gardeners and you're probably very familiar with non-native invasive species, but hey, just so we're all on the same page, I wanted to quickly review what a non-native invasive species is. Okay, so here are two general bullet points. So an organism that is growing or living outside of its native or natural range. And many times these species are introduced by humans, sometimes purposefully. These days, it seems like more accidentally than anything. And then, of course, they are also a species that often spreads very rapidly into an area where they are not wanted, and they cause some sort of harm or they cause a negative impact to the ecosystem that is full of native species. And so two examples that I'm sure you're well aware of in that top right picture is the emerald ash borer. And then does anybody know what's in the bottom picture? So like I said, I'm going to be asking some questions as we go along. You know this if you're on my last webinar. And if you feel comfortable, pop your answer in the chat. Now this plant has sometimes been called the plant that ate the South. And I see right away Linda has it with kudzu. Yeah, so we do have kudzu in Ohio, and I hope that it is not in Michigan. Let me know if it is.
It is in Michigan.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Me too.
Yeah. Okay. So now when it comes to the threat of non-native invasive species towards wildlife, they are definitely one of the leading threats. And so you see from that figure there, 42% of threatened and endangered species are at risk, primarily due to invasive species. Now, what's the #1 threat to wildlife? Loss and degradation of habitat. Okay, that is the #1 threat to Ohio's, to Michigan's, to Indiana's, to basically the majority of our wildlife populations. And I think a valid argument could be made that our non-native invasive species, especially in the case of plants, cause degradation and loss of habitat. And if you don't believe me, hopefully you will after tonight, because I'm going to give you a lot of examples. So, in terms of wildlife, when we look at our non-native invasive plants specifically, we see that they do not provide the resources that our wildlife is looking for, specifically the food and the cover resources that they need. And I'll give you some more specific examples as we go through tonight. Now, this viburnum that you're looking at, arrowwood viburnum, this is a great native shrub for our wildlife species. Birds particularly love these small berries. And can the same be said of some of our non-native invasive plants like honeysuckle and buckthorn and privet? All of the pictures that you see on the bottom of the screen, all of those species, from the box turtle to our cardinal, our swallowtails, and some of our larger game species, take advantage of arrowwood, whether if it's for the cover or the shelter or those berries that it's providing. Okay, so generally speaking, we see that many of our invasive non-native plants are inferior resources to wildlife. And when we start looking at non-native invasive plants as well as insects and how they impact the ecosystem as a whole, when we start to see them taking over forests and causing a lack of diversity, then we see these larger impacts that carry up through our food web. And so maybe a more specific example of this is if we look at some impacts of non-native invasive plants on our lepidopterans. And so if you're not familiar, Lepidoptera is a group of insects that constitutes our butterflies, our moths, and our skippers. And they serve many important roles as herbivores, as pollinators, and as prey. And as we're going to be talking in some detail about songbirds tonight, they are an incredibly important resource to our songbirds as well, an incredibly important food resource. And so I'll share with you a few studies. Excuse me, I'll just pop those up here. And so by looking at these two studies, we see that colonization by invasive species, in these studies, it was honeysuckle and privet, led to a decrease in lepidopteran and native bee abundance and diversity. And there are quite a few other studies like these that show how, or that report the impacts that invasive species have on key mutualistic networks between our plants and animals, such as plants and pollinators. And I forgot to mention before I popped that up, you see that little number 1 on the screen. I thought we could have some fun tonight. And if you don't want to participate, that's totally fine. But I think I have about 15 or so of these little red circles. And so if you want to grab a pen and a piece of paper and just have some fun with some wildlife species ID, most of them are going to be birds, but we do have this one lepidopteran, which I've already given away. So you already have the first one. But at the end, we'll kind of take stock and see how you did, if you got them all right, and if you didn't. It won't be too challenging. I think most of the species are ones that you as master gardeners are probably pretty familiar with. So continuing on a little bit about that discussion that we were having about the impacts of invasive species on our pollinators, I love this quote from Xerces Society. It just really, again, speaks to the importance of this group of animals, that they are a keystone group of animals, and they are continuing or enabling our native trees and shrubs and wildflowers to produce the foods that then serve all of the other wildlife species in a given area. So if you aren't aware, the species that we're looking at in this picture are soldier beetles. And this one is specifically the goldenrod soldier beetle, which is of course the plant that it's on. And this particular insect is what we call a beneficial insect. We like them because not only do they prey on other insects, which can cause issues to a plant, so they kind of help to protect that plant, but they also will feed on nectar and pollen. And as they're feeding on pollen, of course, they will sometimes transfer that pollen to other plants. And so they are considered a pollinator. And so just kind of making the point here that not all of our pollinators are bees or lepidopterans. But of course, we do know that the bees are the real workhorses when it comes to pollination. You might be surprised to learn that we have over 700 species of native bees east of the Mississippi. And many of these native bees play critical roles in pollination when it comes to our native plants. So this little sweat bee is connected to populations of black bears, of squirrels and other small mammals, of deer, and of songbirds. And if you haven't guessed it already, it's because the female pollinates many flowers, but one in particular. And I know it's a close-up picture and it might be a little bit hard to see, but does anybody have any guesses as to what that flower is and how it's think of that connection to those other wildlife species. Yeah, you're getting it. Exactly. So it's dogwood. Yeah, so this little sweat bee pollinates dogwood among other plants. And dogwood, of course, produces berries in the fall that are prized by many wildlife species, as you can see from these pictures. So, I'm sure you all can make that connection when it comes to non-native invasive plants, especially when they start colonizing an area, when we see a decline in our native plant species, which of course is going to impact our pollinators and the services they provide. So as these plants invade our native plant systems, and in the examples I'll be showing you here in a minute, primarily forests, we have to remember that what is on the forest floor becomes our future forest. So if you're seeing garlic mustard, if you're seeing barberry, if you're seeing honeysuckle, or another invasive plant of your choice, and little to no tree seedlings like you see here in this picture, you don't have a future forest because these plants are not allowing for that natural regeneration of our native trees and other woody plants. And of course, you don't have your wildflowers and all of the other things that we enjoy seeing in a forest. Okay, and it's because these invasive species are doing what they do best. They're outcompeting all other plants. So I want to start moving into some specific examples of how non-native invasive plants, and as I said, one example of an insect, and how they're impacting wildlife. And specifically, we're going to be talking about songbirds. And that's because there has been a good amount of research done on the impacts of songbirds. And a lot of the information that I'm going to present took place here in Ohio as well. So, it's very applicable, to Michigan as well. But before we get into that, I do want to spend some time discussing some songbird ecology, specifically their food and cover resources, as these are what are being impacted by invasive species. So when we look at our songbirds, if you're not familiar with this group of animals, they belong to the order Passeriformes, and it is the largest order of birds. You see there over 5,000 species, which makes up about half of all of our bird species. You're familiar with the songbirds, of course, and you see some representative species listed there at the left. And we see we've gotten to our number 2 when it comes to our species ID. So you can jot that down, or if you feel like putting it in the chat box, we can do that too. And while you think about it, I'm going to play the call for this species. Now, what you just heard was kind of pretty warbled and maybe a little garbled, and I see some people have guessed it correctly. This is a catbird. And I'm going to continue playing that song, and you're going to see why it is called a catbird. So that is our gray catbird. This is a fairly common bird across Ohio. It particularly likes woodland edges. So if you're ever, in a park and you're walking along a woodland edge, or maybe a hedgerow or something that butts up against an open area, you might hear a catbird calling, and you might hear that cat like call, and odds are it's a female that is a little agitated that you walked a little close to her nest. Oh, she's gonna call again for us there. Another really neat thing about the songbirds is the fact that they build these intricate nests. You could call them the basket weavers of the bird world. And so we could spend a whole talk talking about the different nests that birds make, which I find fascinating. But I've just chosen a few representatives to kind of show you this talent. Really, it is a talent that they have. And so on the right side, we have the Baltimore Oriole, and they build these remarkable sock-like, I guess you could say, hanging nests that are woven together by lots of different fibers, but usually long, slender fibers. The female does this, and she just starts by hanging these fibers over a branch and then gradually weaving them together. And I don't even think I could attempt to do this, even if I had all the tools in the world. So I'm constantly impressed by what our songbirds are able to do. And then we have the tufted titmouse. This is one of my favorite birds. They're spunky, brave little birds. And one of the reasons is because they will build a simple little cup nest, and they'll incorporate twigs and grass and moss. But then when they're done, they're going to line it. They're going to make a nice little soft little bed for their eggs. And what they like to line it with is fur. And so sometimes they will find fur hanging around from mammals that have shed. Sometimes they will go right to the source. And that's what's going on in this picture. There's a tufted titmouse plucking fur from a sleeping raccoon. And maybe you've even seen this in your yard. Chickadees will do the same thing. If you have your dog sleeping in your yard, they may dart down really quick and pull out some hair. I've even talked to folks that have had a chickadee or a titmouse land on their head and tried to pull their own hair to line their nest. So definitely a brave little bird. And then lastly, we have the red-eyed vireo. And I believe I have the song later for this bird. It's one of the birds that you actually still hear calling in the afternoon. A lot of our birds are kind of quiet during that time of day, but the vireo just keeps on singing all afternoon. But they build these really neat looking nests that you see right here, often in the forked tree branch. And they use a lot of different materials, but they start to kind of hold those materials together using spider webs as kind of the adhesive. And then a lot of times they're going to grab lichen to kind of put on the outside of that nest to conceal it and hide it from predators a little bit better. Equally impressive, of course, are their namesake, their songbirds, and they have these really impressive vocal abilities, where we see many of our birds have multiple calls and multiple songs, which are really the more melodic noises that we hear our birds make. And they're used for a variety of different things, as you can see there. But just to talk a little bit about the anatomy and how that works, calls and songs are produced with a song box, and it's called a syrinx. And I have a little picture that I want to show you here. So there's kind of a close-up picture. And so what you might be noticing is that it's branched. Okay, so this is the syrinx that you're looking at, and it branches into two bronchi. And these two branches each have their own sets of muscles, which essentially means that the birds can make two sounds at once. And so the left side, I'm gonna hopefully play this little clip. There we go. So the left side of the syrinx specializes in lower pitched notes, and the right side specializes in higher pitched notes. And so this allows songbirds to perform, as the Cornell Lab of Ornithology says, vocal gymnastics, which I love that. You know, they can have these seamless sweeps through more pitches than a piano, and they can harmonize with themselves. And so I think a great example of this ability. Just look at it one more time. So now they're calling both at the same time. Many of our songbirds do this, but the wood thrush, I think, is just one of my favorite calls. And I see Verna made a comment about the wood thrush as well. I'll play the call of the wood thrush. I think it sounds like bells or chimes ringing through. So beautiful. Here is another little spunky bird, a little ball of energy. This is, well, I won't give it away just quite yet, but this little bird per unit weight, this little bird has 10 times the sound power of a crowing rooster. It can also produce 16 notes per second and of course decipher between those notes. And we humans cannot decipher between those notes without replaying that slong back at a much slower speed. So I see we have some guesses. Oh, and you're so close, Mary and Kim, with House and Carolina wren. You are correct. It is a wren, but it was a little tricky. This is the winter wren. Not to say that our other wrens have, this same ability, though they're not quite as rapid paced and bubbly as the winter wren. And I'm sorry, I should have gotten a call for this guy, but I don't have it. And then of course we have the mimics. So this bird that you're looking at is a good example of one of the mimics. Now, most birds learn their own calls in the first years of life, but our birds that mimic other sounds and birds, they keep adding to their repertoire. And as they grow older, they can learn up to 200 songs. And even sounds from their environment, like car alarms or a creaky gate, sometimes you'll hear them mimicking that as well. So this is two pictures of this same species. And if you haven't guessed it yet, this is the northern mockingbird. Now here is our next one. Oh, I had the thing out of order, but I know you all would have gotten this. Here's our blue jay. Now blue jays are not a typical mimic like our mockingbird, but they have been known to mimic other calls. And one really neat call that they mimic, I think it's really neat at least, is that of a red-tailed hawk. And they'll use it to their advantage. So sometimes they will do that red hawk call just before coming to a feeder. So it scatters all the other songbirds and they have their choice of the feeder. But it really does. It sounds like a miniature red-tailed hawk. And there have been several times when I've heard that call and I start looking around for the hawk and then I see a blue jay fly away. So they trick me as well. Now, as far as habitat use, let's talk a little bit about how these songbirds use habitats. They use a variety of different habitats, from grasslands to both old and young forests, and of course our wetlands as well. Now, 200 of the 200 breeding birds that we have in Ohio, and again, I'm sorry, I'm an Ohio person. I should have looked to see how many breeding birds you have in Michigan. My apologies. Half use forests, and I'm sure that's not far off from you all in Michigan. I'm sure a good number of your breeding birds use forests. And so I'm just kind of stressing the importance of forests as a resource for our birds, because as we start talking about our non-native invasive plants, those are often areas that they infiltrate and sometimes go unchecked, especially if it's a forest that's not being managed. And I see some of you are already go ahead and guessing that species, and you are correct. It is an eastern towhee. And I don't have a recorded call for the eastern towhee, but it's usually a bird that I always teach when I teach song calls, because it's a really easy one. And if you know what the mnemonic is for eastern towhee, go ahead and pop it in the chat box. It sounds like they're saying a phrase. And I like attaching mnemonics to songs because it helps me to remember what they are. And I don't see anybody putting it in there. So it sounds like the eastern towhee says, drink your tea, drink your tea. And again, I'm sorry, I don't have the call, but you can go to allaboutbirds.com or .org, excuse me, allaboutbirds.org, and you can listen to the Eastern Towhee. And I'll have that website later on in the presentation. Oh, I forgot. I did have the video in there. Let me play it for you. There it is. So hopefully you all heard that. It was a little bit quiet. If I can turn it up a little bit. Nope, it's not going to let me. Well, hopefully you all heard it, but I definitely think it sounds like Drink Your Tea. It's one of those songs I can immediately recognize. Okay. Now, the other thing about songbirds that we have to discuss is, when we talk about conserving them and impacts to their populations, we have to remember that even though we don't see them, or a large majority of them, throughout the whole year, it doesn't mean that that time isn't important. And so what I'm really getting at is we need to discuss their entire life cycle. Okay, so our songbird communities shift in a given year, depending on the time of year. And again, we need to recognize that activities that occur on the overwintering grounds can impact their populations during the breeding season as well. So let's talk just a little bit about migratory songbirds. I love this image that I just skipped past. There it is. This is a radar image from May, and this was actually from 2016. And you might think that that blue area that you're looking at is rainfall, but it's not. The precipitation is represented by the green and yellow areas, and that blue, those are mostly large numbers of migratory birds. And so they were migrating in such large concentration that radar picks them up, which I think is really neat. Now, some of our songbirds, like blue jays, do undergo short migrations during the winter. So I think robins might be another example of that. We see them around, but you may not be seeing the same individual. Now, some of these birds that you see here will stick around in an area all winter long, especially if there are good cover and food resources. But they may be shifting around, and a lot of times that is dependent on food and shelter. And so number 7, as a couple of you have put in, that is the tufted titmouse. So great job. And so here, just again, some common winter residents that we see in Michigan, and then of course in Ohio too. And then we have medium distant migrants. So this is number 8. I'm not going to say who it is quite just yet. But this little bird will stay in North America, moving from their breeding grounds, which is north of us. And let me play this little figure. Hopefully it works. There it is. Hopefully you can see that. So their breeding grounds north of us, though you in the lower peninsula, you do have some breeding populations of this bird. But then they move down during the winter. So at least for those of you in the lower half of Michigan, and for me in Ohio, we see these little birds showing up, the dark-eyed juncos showing up during the winter. So they really are our snowbirds. And then of course we have our long distant migrants. And these are the birds that travel thousands of miles multiple times in a year to reach their overwintering grounds. So you're looking at the yellow-rumped warbler, one of our beautifully colored warblers. When I was in college, I learned them by the nickname Butterbutt, because if you see them flying away, and you can kind of see it right here, they have this nice little yellow patch on their rump. That is their namesake. Now the migrations of these, I'm gonna get this going so you can look at the pattern, the migrational pattern of the yellow-rumped warbler. But the migrations of these long-distance migrants are a fascinating area of study. And we really, unfortunately, don't have time to get into that tonight. But if you want to learn more, I thought I would leave you with a few resources. So Birdcast, that first one, is where you can see images like the one that I've pulled up here. And you can go to this site and essentially look at how birds are migrating any day of the year. So as we are getting closer and closer to the peak migratory season for songbirds, keep an eye on this website. It gets really neat to start seeing all those arrows, and they show the direction that the birds are going. And of course, the blue is the birds and where they are showing up on that radar. And then that second link, there's that allaboutbirds.org. This is the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's. Their All About Birds site. It's fantastic, so much good information. But that's also where you can get tips on ID. It's where you can listen to bird calls. And they have a lot of great information generally about birds. And so this article, if you just kind of do a search for this title, there's a really nice article talking about all of the technology right now that is going on and is being used to study these migrational journeys of birds. So it's an area of study that is really expanding because that technology has allowed researchers to actually track these birds further distances along their journeys. All right, let's move into a brief discussion on food and nesting resources. And so the species that you're looking at on the left, number 9, this is one of our birds that we call a fruit specialist. And so that is the cedar waxwing. And so cedar waxwings, again, specialize in eating berries, and berries in general are a very important food source for many birds. And in some, they are an important staple. Robins would be, I gave it away. There's our robin. And I don't know about your yards, but robins have been going crazy in my yard. And I've just really very much enjoyed waking up in the mornings. And, as I'm heading out to take my girls to school and daycare, just hearing the robins call. It's springtime. It makes me very happy. But robins are also another species that do eat a fair share of berries as well as insects. And so many of our insect eating birds do switch their diets to berries, especially right before migration, because those berries have a good amount of sugar and energy to really help them on their journeys southward. We also have a good number of birds that feed on seeds, and the one pictured on the left is a great example of a seed specialist. They almost always eat just seeds. If they eat an insect, it's probably on accident. They're the ones that love the Niger seeds at your feeders. And this species also nests later in the year. And it is kind of tied to some of those native plants that will produce seeds a little bit later in the year, like our milkweeds and our thistles. And so this is the American goldfinch. I see some of you already guessed that already. And then we have, again, our dark-eyed junco on the right there. And we see that juncos are also, that a large part of their diet is seeds. Other birds incorporate nuts into their diets. And we already kind of talked a little bit about blue jays, but we're going to talk a little bit more about them. They, in truth, are more omnivorous or omnivores. They eat not just nuts, but berries and seeds and insects, sometimes even other animals. And yes, they do get a bad reputation. They can be the bullies of the bird world, but there's some neat things about blue jays, one of which you're looking right here, this mutualistic relationship they have with oaks. And basically, blue jays cache a lot of acorns every year, and they don't remember where they cache all of them. They often cache them in the ground, and so those that they forget then have the chance to grow into a tree. One other interesting thing about the blue jay, and this is something that you can look for this summer, is that the crest on the top of their head is correlated with their level of aggression. For example, the lower the crest, the more at ease the bird is, the lower its aggression. And then the higher the crest, the higher the bird's agitation level. So usually when a blue jay squawks and then flies away, that crest is held up. So note that and see if you see that this summer. Now, the white-breasted nuthatch and number 12 here are two other species that you may mistake as seed eaters because we frequently see them visiting are bird feeders, which are full of seed. But they actually, the majority of their diet is actually seeds. So the white-breasted nuthatch there on the left consumes mostly insects. And then I see some of you have already guessed it. This is the chickadee, and this is actually the Carolina chickadee. Black-capped is also a great guess. It's difficult to tell the difference between them. You guys up in Michigan have the black-capped. And chickadees during the winter, their diet is half seed during the winter, but during the summer, it's 80 to 90% insects. And they also feed on spiders and other insects that are on the vegetation of leaves and also on tree bark. So speaking of insects, let's talk a little bit about our insect eaters. Insects are a major food source for many of our birds, and for some species, they are the major food source. So here, this is number 13. It's a little bit tougher one if for those of you. Yep, some of you know your calls very well. Good job, Diana. So this is the eastern phoebe, and this is one of our flycatchers. And you'll often see them kind of perched like this on vegetation, especially in a more open area where they like to hunt for their insects. And then here's our red-eyed vireo. Sorry, that name popped up there for number 14. But I said I would play their call, and so I want to play that for you. So, like I said, the red-eyed vireo keeps on calling all day long. Answer my talk. I didn't realize this song was so long. But I think that their call sounds like kind of a question. Here I am. Where are you? Where are you? Here I am. Kind of like that. So that might be something that helps you identify their call. And last but not least, there we go. We have our warblers. There are over 50 species of warblers in North America, but few combine brilliant bright color and easy viewing as the yellow warbler, and that's who you're looking at right here. And their song is very, very sweet. Sweet, 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 I'm so sweet. All right. E.O. Wilson said that insects are the little things that run the world. And when it comes to birds, that is a fact. Okay, 96% of North American terrestrial birds rely on insects and other arthropods. So insects are an incredibly important food source. And as we've already learned, we know that our non-native invasive plants can impact some of our insect populations. So wrapping things up on our songbird ecology side, talk a little bit about nesting resources. And so we do have birds that are called cavity nesters. And as the name implies, these birds are looking for a cavity to build their nest in. Ideally one that is formed naturally in a tree or was created by a woodpecker. But as you can see in these pictures, some of these cavity nesters are perfectly happy to use a man-made nest box. And so the wrens are two great examples of that. And the Carolina wren as well. Both of these birds are fierce competitors for cavities or nest boxes. So if you are having some issues with house wrens in your bluebird boxes, I would suggest that you move your box to a more open area. These species a lot of times like to nest along woodland edges or in shrub layers. And so sometimes if we have our boxes a little too close, we have issues with wrens. Carolina wren call. Tea kettle, tea kettle. That's what I think. Now, both of these birds are comfortable in backyards. The Carolina wren in particular has been known to nest in some pretty odd places, and I wanted to share those with you because I get a kick out of them. So if you ever encounter just a nest in a really weird spot and it kind of has this like cave-like appearance, then odds are it's a Carolina wren. There's a nest in a helmet, and sometimes they will sneak into garages and nest in a helmet or an old pair of boots. Here they are in a folded up patio chair. Lots of pictures of clothes that are left on the line for too long, and you see nests being built inside the pockets, and using that's, I think, an interesting birdhouse, and plastic bags. And then they really do like boots. And I love this picture because this person they went with it. They're like, all right, you want to nest in my boot? Here, let me put the boot out in a place where I don't mind you nesting in it. So they just nailed it to a tree. And then here is just a quick picture of some other common cavity nesters, and it would apply to Michigan as well. We have the tufted titmouse. We have the tree swallow. This is the tree swallow. We often see them nesting right alongside bluebirds, as they like that open habitat, just like our bluebirds do. The prothonotary warbler and the great crested flycatcher. So this is the only flycatcher that nests in cavities. And then the last picture on the right there is number 15, and it's my favorite picture I've ever snapped of this, this particular songbird, this cavity nester. This little female was so industriously building her nest for the season that she did not hear me walking up. And so I snapped a picture and then I snuck away because I didn't want to disturb her. And yes, that is the eastern bluebird. Now, as we transition back to a discussion on invasive species, I want to discuss where birds that breed in forests nest. And when you consider all of the different bird species that will nest in a forest, and then you think of, their populations, the number of those individual species, within a given forest, you start to really wonder, wow, where does each female or each pair find the space to build their nests? How are they not constantly tripping over one another? And what they actually do is something called habitat partitioning. So they kind of separate the forest into different layers. And you can see those layers right here: ground layer, shrub layer, mid-story layer, canopy layer. And we see different species nesting in those different layers. So ovenbirds are one of our ground nesters. In the shrub layer, you may find a hooded warbler, like you see here. You may also find the towhee that we talked about earlier, the gray catbird, cardinals, wood thrushes. And then if you go up a little higher into the understory, you might see your or understory to midstory, you may see your red-eyed vireo, your scarlet tanager, maybe the Acadian flycatcher. And then up even higher in the overstory, you might see some of the warblers, and this is the cerulean warbler. So this is kind of one of the ways they help to avoid competition with one another. Bottom line is that the structure of the forest is really important to our breeding songbirds. And that structure can really be altered by the invasion of non-native invasive plants. And so transitioning into that discussion, I'll show you an example of this. And so here we're going to look at an insect. We're going to look at the hemlock woolly adelgid and the impacts it's having on bird communities. And so if you're not familiar with the hemlock woolly adelgid, it is a non-native invasive aphid-like insect. It attacks hemlock trees, and it is native to Asia. But it's been in Ohio since 2012. It's been in Michigan since 2016. And on your Michigan DNR site, I found this map. So I hope that it is still current. So you can kind of see where in the state it is found. Thankfully, it's not too prevalent yet in Michigan. The adelgid is a very small insect, and it is transported primarily by the wind, which tells you how small and light it is. It can also be transported by nursery stock that is infested with the adelgid. And unfortunately, it can also be transported on the wing of birds. Don't know how prevalent this is and how often it's happening, but we do know that it is happening. And so when we look at our our songbirds and their connection to hemlocks, we see that there are some species that are known as hemlock specialists. In fact, 90 different species of birds use hemlock forests, meaning they prefer hemlock stands to any other. If you've ever stood beneath a hemlock, you have probably noticed its dense canopy, how it creates just a really wonderfully cool and shady spot, and the birds appreciate that too. So some examples would be the blue-headed vireo, the Blackburnian warbler, and the black-throated green warbler. So some examples of those hemlock bird specialists. Now, this research that I'm going to share by Tony's and others is from research conducted in Delaware and New Jersey. And so in areas where hemlock woolly adelgid has invaded, they have been reporting changes in the bird communities. Researchers have reported that those hemlock bird specialists, no surprise, have declined across those infested stands. And so just looking at one of the species, the black-throated green warbler, they noted a 30% decline. And there's the call. Z, 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 zoo. Actually, it's Z, Z, zoo, zoo, Z. One of the first warbler songs that I learned. But while the specialists are declining, what they found is that other bird species were increasing. Species like the eastern wood pewee, the hooded warbler, and the wood thrush. And so why is that? Well, it goes back to what we talked about and how important forest structure is to birds, okay? And so the answer has to do, again, with that physical structure. So as hemlocks die, okay, more light is penetrating the canopy and reaching the forest floor. This results in understory vegetation and the release of deciduous trees that were hanging out, growing slowly under the canopy of the hemlocks. Well, now they've received a healthy dose of sunlight and they're going to really start growing. So after time, the once dominated hemlock forest looks very different. And this change in both the forest structure and the composition, the species there, is now favorable to different bird species. Those that like the shrub layer, like the hooded warbler that we talked about. Those that favor forest edges, like the eastern wood pewee. And those that prefer mature deciduous forests, like the wood thrush. Okay, so those are the species that are showing these strongest increases. Again, it has to do with that structure. Now, the good-ish news is that these hemlock bird specialists, to them, an unhealthy hemlock, one that is infested, is still better than no hemlock. And so our hemlock trees are able to be treated to increase their lifespan. And that's why early detection of the hemlock woolly adelgid is so important. So we can start treating those trees as early as possible and extend their longevity and the habitat they're providing to those specialists. In the long term, this replacement of hemlock stands by other forest communities, like the deciduous forest communities that we were just talking about, is likely going to lead to a less diverse, more homogeneous bird community across the area. And this is not an unfamiliar story when it comes to non-native invasive species. Similar studies have found changed or declined bird communities in emerald ash borer infested stands and in stands that have been invaded by honeysuckle. Okay, so again, a decline of diversity is a common ecological response when a non-native invasive species is introduced into a new area. So I want to move into a few examples, a few more specific examples, I guess, of how non-native invasive plants can impact our songbird populations. And in these examples, it shows how tricky those non-native invasive plants can be. They're making birds believe that they provide resources that are good for them, when in fact they end up causing something bad to happen. And this is essentially called an ecological trap. Okay, so an ecological trap occurs when animals mistakenly prefer habitat. It could be any component of that habitat, like a food resource or cover resource. where their fitness is lowered. Okay, that's negative impact that they would not have succumbed to had they used other habitats. So let me give you an example. But before I do that, we have to talk about the importance of berries for birds. So we know that berries are good for birds. Birds are also good for the berries, or rather the plant that is producing the berries. Most berries are designed to be eaten by birds so that the birds will disperse their seeds, ideally away from the parent plant, right? And in most cases, this is successful, not in this situation. Could not resist sharing that with you. But to ensure that seeds are dispersed, the plant protects each seed in a fleshy pulp full of sugar and fats, and then it wraps it up in this glossy, colorful coat that brings birds flying. It's pretty smart of the plant. That's what they're doing there. And so when we go back to our non-native invasive plants, in this example, in this picture, our bush honeysuckle, our Lonicera species, that plant is doing everything it needs to do to ensure that its seeds are spread and eaten by the birds. You know, it produces an abundance of fruit. They are brightly colored, and they have that nice fleshy pulp. Unfortunately, as research has shown, these berries, specifically honeysuckle and those found on multiflora rose, are not as nutritious as those berries of our native plants. Okay, so lower calories, and there's been other research that has found that the lipid content is less, so the fat content is less. So all around an inferior food source. Unfortunately, the birds are showing no preference between our non-native invasive plants and our natives. And so because these birds are eating them indiscriminately, they are, you know, of course, they're eating a lower quality food, which is bad for them, but they're dispersing them across the landscape. And sorry, my 2-year-old was knocking at the door, slightly distracting. So this is why we humans play a critical role when it comes to honeysuckle removal, because the birds are not going to stop eating them unless they're just not there. Here's another example of how invasive species are ecological traps. You're looking at two reports from two different research papers. And the first one you see reported that wood thrush and robin suffered hired nest predation when they built their nests in honeysuckle and buckthorn. And then you see that cardinals, when they nested in honeysuckle, fewer of their young survived. So what is going on here? Well, it turns out that the early leaf out of honeysuckle is very appealing to our songbirds. So for example, say you are a cardinal, you've stuck around all winter long, and you're a male, and you're waiting to start establishing your nesting territory, to start calling and bringing in a female so you can start building a nest. And you start looking around, where am I going to set up my nesting territory? Well, I'm a shrub nester. I like to nest in that shrub layer. Oh, look at that forest. There's some nice green plants right at the shrub layer, right exactly at the level that I am looking at. Well, now picture that some of you are robins, some of you are wood thrush, and you're all thinking the same thing. So what ends up happening is that a high concentration of nests end up in invasive shrubs in the early part of the year, which then makes it very easy for nest predators, for example, raccoons, to clue in and raid those nests. Okay, so that's why we see research results like that. That's what's going on. Now, I guess the good news is as the growing season continues and more plants, native plants in particular, leaf out, then you start seeing those nests being built in other places and better dispersed and less of that nest predation going on. But in the early season, it can be tough for the nesting birds. So I've just given you some examples of the impacts of non-native invasive plants on songbirds. Why is this important? Well, you know, we're losing our birds. If you haven't seen this research, I'm introducing it to you now. 3 billion birds have been lost since 1970. And so that works out to be about 1 in 4 birds. Okay. And it's largely due to lack of habitat, or that loss and degradation of habitat that we started talking about in the presentation. And you see that these declines, we're not just talking a specific species. These declines are happening across guilds. Those birds that use grasslands, are migratory species, are aerial insectivores that we really depend on to help with the control of our insect populations. Okay, and of course, it's not just our non-native invasive species contributing to that habitat loss, but they are certainly playing a role. And this decline in birds really signals a broader crisis, one that has also been documented with insect declines. So what can we do? When it comes to birds, the website at the top of the screen was put together, based on this research. Those researchers thought, okay, we're given some really bad news to everybody. Let's give them some action items, some things to do to really help the birds. And so they put together this website and these 7 simple actions to really help the birds. We can recover species. We've done it before. As you can see, the bald eagle is a great example of that. But we all definitely need to play our parts. And so I know you all as master gardeners, you're already doing that. But I do want to go into a little bit more detail on one of these action items, which is using native plants, and just share some lists of plants that are great for songbirds. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I will share these slides so you don't have to hurriedly jot down these plants. But here's just a short list of herbaceous plants that are great as a seed source, as well as attracting insects and even nesting material, especially as we look at our milkweeds, our cinnamon fern, and some of our native thistles. And hopefully if you are planting, especially our native perennial plants, you are leaving them standing for the birds into fall and maybe into winter. I usually keep a few of mine at least, standing until spring. And I will also cut off some of the other ones about 18 to 24 inches above the ground, especially if those stems are hollow or have a soft inside, so our native bees can nest in them. Here's a list of plants that are great for hummingbirds as well as other pollinators. So the cardinal flower is that beautiful red in the middle, and then we have monarda or bee balm. And then this is the great blue lobelia. So great options for the hummingbirds. And then remember our discussion about berries for birds. Okay, so that's something really important to keep in mind, especially, if you're looking for some shrubs. I always like choosing shrubs for wildlife that have berries on them. But, in general, you can kind of look for woody plants that provide 2 or more of these habitat requirements, dense growth form, especially if we look at our evergreens that are going to provide some winter cover all year round. But, some of our deciduous have these really dense growth forms. So hawthorn would be a great example of that. And those are the ones that are going to be some really nice nesting and cover resources for our birds. And again, of course, think about the food that it's producing, whether it's a fruit, a seed, or nectar. And here's just, again, another list. And every single one of the species that you see here in some way, shape, or form, if not multiple, provides a resource for birds. So good ones to consider incorporating into the landscape. And if you want more plant lists, you can check out my blog. I think I shared this with you in my last webinar, but here it is again. And I've written a few articles on attracting wildlife. And so I have some longer plant lists posted there. And then finally, another thing that you all can do, and you already are, I know you already are, when it comes to our non-native invasive plants, is to raise awareness within the public. I love this quote from the Arizona Game and Fish Department. I've been using it for years. Channeling the energies of the public into constructive action. That's what we need to do. So, and again, that's what you all are doing as master gardeners. So thank you. But if you're not aware, we also have an app to help you detect invasive species and to track them. And so this is the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app. It is a regional app. So we use it in Ohio. It can be used in Michigan, in Indiana, in Wisconsin. And it is available on both iPhone and Android phones. And you can get to the download page with that first app right there, the go.osu.edu Glennon. And then if you want to learn more about the app and how it works, myself and my coworkers put together a webinar back in June, July of last year that talks all about the app and how you use it. And even if you don't want to report with it, there's great information on invasive species in the app and ID information to help you. I am part of a program called woodlandstewards.osu.edu. We offer a lot of workshops and classes, though as of late, of course, as many others, we're doing webinars. And so we have been posting our webinars, and this is an old picture, but where my scroll or my little pointer is, there's a tab that is listed resources. And again, you don't see it here, sorry. But if you click on that resources tab, you can see webinars, and we've done at least 10 webinars on forestry and wildlife issues. So feel free to check them out. The other thing I wanted to point out is under our publications, we have several fact sheets on managing and controlling and identifying non-native invasive species. And I'm sure Michigan has their own great set of resources as well. Here are just some additional resources that that I love and that I use to put this presentation together. And there's my contact information. So thank you all so much for sharing the evening with me to learn about birds and non-native invasive plants. So I'll stop sharing if we have any questions.
And of course, we do have questions.
Wonderful.
Martha would like to know if goldfinches are vegetarians, what do they feed their kids?
Yeah, great question. So they do actually feed their kids seeds. And I didn't share it, but if anybody's familiar with cowbirds and what cowbirds do, they're actually what's known as brood parasites. So the female will lay her eggs in the nest of another bird and then rely on that bird to raise her young. Well, if she lays her egg in the nest of a goldfinch, a lot of times that cowbird young does not survive because the cowbird young need insects and they can't often survive on that mostly seed, if not fully seed diet that the mom goldfinches feed their young.
Verna said, have you heard that the bluebird's favorite food is Japanese beetles? Is that false?
I have not heard that. You know, I don't know about any connection between bluebirds and Japanese beetles. I know bluebirds, they don't specialize in any particular kind of insect. They're going to eat a lot of different kinds. So wouldn't surprise me if they happened across one and they ate it. But no, I have not heard that.
And Marilyn said she missed your blog website. Would you share that again?
I will. Let me go back.
While you're doing that, Lisa's asking, will there be any webinars on mute swans as an invasive or other waterfowl? Not this time.
Yeah. Yeah, but mute swans are definitely, yeah, definitely, you could call them a non-native invasive species. And we definitely watch for them here in Ohio. And I know this was a while back, but, and I think it still happens, folks will put them on their ponds because they're beautiful birds. And at times they were even used to deter geese. But that is very much discouraged now as they can have some pretty negative impacts on some of our native swans.
And is there a site that helps identify nests?
So I would, let me pull up the chat. And I'm going to type in Nest Watch. I think it's nestwatch.org. Yeah, so that's another program out of Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's actually a citizen science program, but I believe there's some good information there on different types of nests. I also I like the Peterson guide. There's I think a nest of Eastern North American birds. And I still use that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mary wants to know, do cardinals signal their moods with their crests the way blue jays do? I've seen them raising and lowering their crests at my feeders.
Me too. Oh, that's a good question. I've never made that connection. I don't know. I'd have to look into it. Or, hey, do a little citizen science of your own.
Yeah.
Do a little test and see what you figure out.
So, Marnie, one of the issues in Michigan we deal with, our whole state is covered with autumn olive bushes.
Yes.
And the fruit in the fall is really devastating to the migrating birds because it's full of sugar and it doesn't have a lot of protein or fats to help.
Yep.
So I wanted to mention that. It's another reason why you see some organizations trying to get rid of them.
Right. And autumn olive has an interesting story. You know, we all learn as we go, and that was a plant that for a time our wildlife agencies and natural resources agencies were promoting because we thought it was a good plant to promote. And, you know, we live and learn, unfortunately, had no idea how invasive it would be.
Yes.
But yeah, that's another, I didn't talk too much about that one, but that's another.
In our county, they gave them away for free every year. So
oh, we did that here too. I know.
And then I wanted to remind people earlier this month, we had a presentation with Claire Peterson from MSU on the MISSN reporting app that we encourage people in Michigan to use. So if you missed that, please go to our webpage at michiganmastergardenerassociation.org. I believe that's it. And you can view the presentation on MISSN and learn how to download a free app and how to use it. We're trying to get more master gardeners to be interested in using that because you're the ones that are out in the woods, hiking, looking around. You have a better understanding of what plants are and how to identify. And it's great. You can take pictures and send them in, and it will locate where you are, so you don't have to try to figure out in the woods your location. So, okay, Mary would like to know, oh no, that's the one that was already there. I guess that's it.
I did just, sorry, I was typing as you were chatting.
Oh, okay.
I did just answer a question about, are Canada geese a native species? Yes, they are.
Oh, okay.
I just commented on a few other ones. Yeah. That might have been the one you were looking for. Sorry.
No, I just jump up and down. I thought, oops. And then just a little lesson I have learned over the past few years. I've been an avid birder, and, you know, I put out nests and lots of areas for them to feed, different kinds of feed. And the blue jays, like you said, are always the bullies. And I noticed other birds will eat together on a feeder platform. They'll eat with squirrels beside them. And it's always the jays that clear it out and just pig everything down. So
right.
I bought peanuts in the shell, and I got the metal rings that you can get, the wreaths. And then I bought some other feeders for those, and I hung them in a different location in my yard. And it keeps the blue jays over there.
Good.
And he's happy at the other bird feeders. But the squirrels today, it's been interesting because there must be a storm coming, because instead of eating the peanuts, they're burying them all over in my garden. So I know I'm going to get a lot of peanuts coming up this.
Yeah, you are. My husband is, very much right now into our grass and making sure everything is nice and beautiful and uniform. And we can always tell where the chipmunk caches are because there'll be this sprout of little, sunflower seeds coming up in the middle of the yard. It's funny.
It is funny. Well, unless there are any more questions, Marty, this has just been so encouraging and makes me really want spring to come a little faster than it is.
We're all
And I'm
excited.
with you. The first time you hear robin in the spring, you think, oh,
Yay.
life after winter.
Red-winged blue. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Red-winged blackbird, same thing.
Yes. So I hope that you can all join us Saturday at 1:00 for our botanical quest, documenting Michigan's rare native flora through photography. And it's just so interesting. Our presenter has been in the UP, all over the lower peninsula. He gets a phone call and he, grabs a bag and his camera and he's gone to get pictures of really rare plants, native plants that are growing all around Michigan. So I just find it very insightful to learn about all this. So I hope you can all join us then. And again, Marnie, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Happy spring, everybody.
Yes. Good night, everyone.